First thing I want to say is I found the morning absolutely riveting. This is my first time at this conference, and I'm often asked in my capacity as chairman of Barrick by our investors, so you're trying to turn this company around and bring it back to life, and so where are you on the journey? And I usually say, well, we're still in the very early stages. Let's say, I don't know, 3 or 4 out of 10. As I'm sitting here this morning listening to this conversation, I'm thinking to myself, no, we're not 3 or 4 out of 10. We're like 1 out of 10. And you can be forgiven for asking, what is the chairman of a mining company doing in this conference on this topic? Because the industry has been, in a sense, the opposite of a lot of what's being discussed here. So if you looked at the destruction of capital, the destruction of communities, the destruction of the environment, mining ranks right up there at the top. And also, if you just looked at it in a very narrow business sense, and you graded it on the criteria of being bold, it would come somewhere near the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to tell you our story just as I would tell it to our owners or anyone else, so you get a flavor of sort of where we're coming from, what we're trying to do, and then we can open it up to questions. We believe strongly that the way you best understand an individual or an enterprise is to go back to their origins and understand the DNA of that person or that institution and what made him or her or that institution distinctive. And in our particular case, and I happen to believe this is true of almost every company, in our particular case, we were started by an iconic entrepreneur who essentially with a bunch of his friends got together and decided they wanted to go into this business. And they went into the business and they were highly successful. And they were a group of friends who had real economic and emotional ownership of the business. And they were very nimble and quick. And they were also prudent. And for probably 3/4 of Barrick's existence, they were kind of the iconic company in this field. And then like a lot of companies, for lots of different reasons, they sort of lost their way and started drifting away from what they originally were. So the first observation that I had coming in as an outsider, there were sort of parallel observations. On the one hand, I said to people internally, listen, as I observe what you guys do for a living, you think you're in the mining business. That's actually not your business. Your core business is partnering with host governments, provincial governments, municipal governments, indigenous people, NGOs, and other partners. That's actually the core of your business. The taking things out of the ground is actually rather straightforward. There are many companies who do that quite well. Obviously, you've got to do it in an efficient, sustainable manner, et cetera, but that's actually the easy part of the business. The real business is the partnership business. Secondly, your original DNA was a partnership DNA. And by partnership, in the first instance, as an internal matter, we mean both financial and emotional engagement far beyond what you typically find in a public company. And then we also mean the following characteristics. When I say partnership, I mean a culture based on trust. Obviously, if you and I are partners, we have to trust each other until such time as we show ourselves not to be trustworthy. The currency of trust is transparency. And I mean that very, very pragmatically. If we're partners, I know what you know and you know what I know essentially all the time. It's a culture of peers, meaning it doesn't matter who's notionally senior or junior. It doesn't matter who's notionally more powerful or less powerful. When you're sitting in a room talking about a problem, you must treat each other as peers or you simply won't get the best ideas and you won't get the respect required to build trust. And then finally, it's a culture in which you must believe, not because I tell you this, but because you genuinely believe it, that the collective is stronger than the aggregation of the individuals. And that the collective, by and large, will make better decisions, and the collective, by and large, will mitigate risk. And then finally, you individually have to prefer that culture. You have to genuinely want to be in that kind of culture. You want to be part of a collective more than you want to be the star of the show. So that's the culture. Then the second part of going back to the original DNA was the business model. Very simple, small head office, nothing between the head office and the economic activity, delegate it all down, and let the important decisions get made as close to the economic activity as possible. When I arrived at Barrick, it was 400 people in Toronto, 1,000 people between Toronto and the mines, and then the mines. So you had 1,400 people sitting on top of the mines, costing $500 million a year of unallocated expense, and you had to ask yourself, what do all these people do? And whatever the answer is, it's not a good answer, essentially. So it turns out, if you haven't read it, you should read it. There's a very good book called The Outsiders. It turns out that business model I just described is, in fact, empirically, the most successful business model. The book The Outsiders, just to take a quick tangent on that, was written in 2012 by a private investor who got very taken with the question, was Jack Welch truly the greatest CEO ever? And so he went to the dean of the Harvard Business School and he said, can you loan me some researchers to empirically look at all the companies in the last 50 years and find out, were there any CEOs who had a better record than Jack Welch? And they did the work for 10 years and they came back and it turned out there were 8 people who had a better record. And that was the Warren Buffetts of the world and so forth. And it also turned out that all 8 of the people came from outside the industry on which they were leading, and all 8 had the business model I just described. And I think the primary relevance of that is twofold. One, that to be bold, it's almost inevitable you've got to come from outside the industry, whatever industry it is. And secondly, that it's very important that the key decisions, the key economic decisions, are made closest to where the activity is actually taking place. So that's the business model that we've adopted, and so far it's going very well. Now, then the question is, sort of, where do you go from here? And about, I don't know, maybe a year ago, I'm on the board of the Ford Motor Company, and we had a board meeting in Silicon Valley, and as part of that meeting, the board is broken up into small groups, and we were sent out to go visit various Silicon Valley companies. I happened to be in the subgroup that went to visit Cisco, and in the meeting at Cisco, John Chambers did a wonderful job describing the digital world and where it was going and so on. And he was essentially pitching the idea there should be a strategic relationship between Cisco and Ford. That particular idea wasn't taken up right in the room. At the end of the meeting, I went up to Chambers and I said, listen, I don't know if you think this applies to us or not, but I'm very interested in the idea of a strategic relationship between Barrick and Cisco. Make a long story short, brought the top 20 people from Barrick out to Silicon Valley, spent the entire day with Chambers and his colleagues, and out of that eventually grew a strategic relationship in which we are now creating a digital mining company. And what does that mean in sort of real life? I'll give you 2 simple examples. So for the first time in my life, I went down into an underground mine 1 month ago. And so you go down 2,500 feet, you get out, it's pitch black. I mean, there's not a light anywhere. You can't see anything, except for the little light on your head and your helmet. And then you get into a Ford truck, and then they take you through this maze of very small, I'll call them roads, and there might be 3 feet on either side of the truck. And so now you can see a little bit because the truck's headlights are there. And the guy's driving me around, and so I say to him, tell me something, why aren't there any lights in this place? And he basically, he looks at me like this is some kind of absurd question. And, well, you know, that's just not the way mining is done. And we don't really need them, and it's expensive. And, okay, so I move on. Then later on, I'm given a presentation on innovation. And the presentation is the following. Well, one of the problems with underground mines is that things break down. trucks break down, equipment breaks down. And when that happens, of course, you've got to fix it. The problem is you have 2 shafts that go down. Let's think of those as elevators. 2 elevators that go down. And those things, that's the only way you can get down there. So, of course, they're very much in demand. And therefore, you've got to schedule what's going down when. And therefore, if a truck breaks down and it has a certain part that is the reason it broke down, you've got to get the part. And you've got to put it in the queue, and it's got to come down the shaft. You make it the part in 3 hours or 3 days or 3 weeks. And of course, that's very inefficient. So one young enterprising guy who works in the maintenance area underground, I've got an idea. Why don't I build a wooden chest, and I'll stick in the chest one key part of everything I need. And therefore, if something breaks down, I got a part right here. And of course, it makes perfect sense. But I'm thinking to myself, and by the way, I applaud what he's doing. He's a young kid. But I'm thinking to myself, if this is what passes for innovation, we've got a major league problem here. And so fast forward, I think it was last week. I'm somewhere else in the world. I'm taken into another underground mine. And this one is right on the edge of the ocean. So you go down 800 meters, you go in 800 meters, and you're under the ocean. And so go down 800 meters, I get out, there are lights all over the place. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. So I say to my host, why do you guys have all these lights? He looks at me like I'm crazy. He says, well, first of all, it's a regulation, safety regulation. And secondly, it's just a nicer, more human place to work. And then we go into the mine, the truck, the whole thing. And there's a lot of automation down there. You see very, very few people. But and it's clean. Frankly, you could have eaten your food off the ground. It was like a hospital almost. Get out of the mine. I then get taken about 5 miles away to see the control room for the mine. And you walk into this room, and there's 15-foot high ceilings, and along this big wall is like a NASA-looking kind of control center. And on one side turns out there are 500 cameras in the mine. So on one side you can see everything that's going on anywhere in the mine, and on the other side are all these kinds of different controls. Then there are 3 rows of desks with computer terminals with young people looking at each one of these little controls to make sure things are being well run. And they have a policy of what they call 00. No fatalities and no environmental transgressions. And they meet this standard. So here's the catch, which is to me very counterintuitive, I think. So the first mine I described is sitting right in the middle of the United States. The second mine I described is sitting in China. And of course, it's completely upside down from what you would expect. I tell you that story because the Chinese mine goes in the direction of what technology can do and what a digital mine looks like, which is wholly different than what most mines look like in the world. And I'll give you one final example of this, which is in the gold business, in order to extract gold, you often have to use cyanide to get it out. And cyanide is a very dangerous chemical, as you know. And so what happens too often is there are so-called cyanide spills. And then the spill goes into the local river, and it gets taken downstream. And downstream there are communities. And then the cyanide either does or certainly could kill the people or the livestock or whatever's there. And so as you can imagine, mining companies are very focused on this. But the way they currently focus on it, or at least the way we currently focus on it, is there's some human being, and his job is to go check on the cyanide that there hasn't been a spill. And if there is one, then his job is to flag it and get it sorted out before it gets downstream. So what happens, as you can imagine, every so often, the guy doing the job either doesn't do the job or does it badly, or does it 5 hours after he should have done the job. And then he goes on his break, and maybe he tells his boss, maybe he doesn't. Maybe the boss. In the mining world, the instinct is to kind of keep things in. So by the time any serious person gets hold of this information and it gets addressed, it could be anything from 24 hours to 7 days or longer. And so, of course, that doesn't make any sense. So we said to ourselves, wait a second. Number one, why don't we just simply have sensors in the water? Pick it up like this, and real-time monitoring. And then why don't we take that real-time monitoring and just make it available to everybody? Give it to the local community, give it to the regulators, give it to the government officials, anyone who wants it. And you could sit there literally with your iPhone, and you could see it real time. Because number one, we shouldn't care about who finds out there's a problem. What we should care about is that we find out fast and we fix it. And in addition to that, what I'm describing, that kind of transparency to the community in which you're operating, would be so counter to what they're used to that you'd start to rebuild trust, going back to where I started, which is that trust is the essence of a partnership culture. And so these are the kinds of really rather simple things we can be doing right this minute, which we are starting to do, which go down the direction of the so-called digital mine, and then you go a lot further than that, and starts to get us towards our goal. Our goal is to be a leading company in any industry, in any geography, anywhere in the world, and our goal is not to be a leading mining company or a leading gold mining company. We just want to be a leading company. And so my final comment, and then I'll open it up. So when we at the head office are dealing with the people who are actually doing the business, and remembering this business is the opposite of everything I've done in my life. My life's been filled for the whole time, essentially in the world of ideas. That's what the financial services world is. That's what the educational world is. So you're dealing at a very high level of abstraction, and you're very taken with good ideas. As you get older in life and you get more jaundiced, when you're young, you think that good ideas are the coolest thing. And that's how you kind of get your street cred. You're the smartest person in the room. When you get older, you realize good ideas are actually rather commonplace. That's not the issue. The issue is good ideas that actually get done. So I'm fond of saying to our people internally, listen, execution is 98% of life. And the good and the bad news is the difference between those who execute at a very high level and are the leaders in the world, and those who operate or execute at a high level but are not the best in the world, the difference is very small. In fact, I often say to them, let me give you this analogy. You remember when Michael Phelps won his 8 gold medals? So if you aggregated all the time between Michael Phelps and all 8 of the guys who got the silver medal, you're talking about less than 10 seconds. So less than 10 seconds separates the greatest swimmer ever and 8 guys you never heard of. So I say that's exactly the way I feel about anything else. So the difference is very small, but unfortunately, it's the whole damn thing. So you don't get any, you get no credit for getting 95 on the test. You start at 95, and then you go up. So you better be 96, 7, 8, 9, or 100. And so that's where we are in our mentality. And so our goal is to be a leading company, and in doing so, to be a model for 2 things. One, what a leading company looks like and how it behaves. And related to that, because we'll get into this later, from the minute I took this, in fact, before I took this role, because I've been spending the last 15 years focused entirely on China. Before I took the role, I went to the senior Chinese leadership and I said, listen, I've been asked to take on this role. I'm inclined to do it, but I'm only going to do it if you want me to do it. Because I believe passionately, and this is consistent with what was said earlier, that the way in which China rises the way in which it comes into the existing order, how that all occurs, is the single most important geopolitical event of our lifetime. And so if I can make a modest contribution to that, I can die happy. And therefore, I said, I believe, by definition, any company in the world, China's going to be at the center of your thought process. If we can model the way China engages with a 21st century leading Western company, that's good for that company, that's good for China, and it's good as a model for others. So we're sort of consciously saying to ourselves, as a kind of byproduct of what we're doing, we wish to be a model for others. Not that it's the only model, but a model. And so that's the long and the short of the Barrick story, and I'll stop there and open it up for comments or questions.
I'll ask a question or two of John, and then again, we've got mics, or you can use Twitter. Let's actually start with China. We asked this question of Kevin Rudd when he was here Tuesday night, another leader who's very knowledgeable about China. What do we in the West not understand about China that we should understand, or that we misunderstand that we need to fix?
You know, one thing I was going to mention when I was talking about the Barrick story, which I should have mentioned, which is related, is that it became kind of commonplace over the last, I would say, since the Reagan years, and it's ebbed a little bit recently, but commonplace to worship at the altar of the free market. The free market was kind of everything. And often in worshiping there, people cited all the way back to Adam Smith, through to Milton Friedman, et cetera. And they cited Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. And they seem somewhere along the line to have missed Adam Smith's earlier book, The Moral Sentiments, written in 1759, which is essentially let's call it the ethical underpinning for the capitalist system. And what Smith says in that first book is essentially, yes, human beings are self-regarding, but they're also other-regarding, that they have sympathy for other human beings. And one of the things I like to say inside Barrick is, let me remind you, you're a human being first, you are a part of a community second, and you're a business person third. And don't forget that moral hierarchy. And all of this must be coherent and must be unified. It cannot be compartmentalized. So the reason I go through all of that is simply to say, a problem in the world, but certainly a problem in relation to China and the rest of the world, but particularly China and the United States, is our level of knowledge. I'm talking now about the United States, including among the elite, is pitiful. And when I say it's pitiful, in particular, it's woefully inadequate in terms of understanding through the lens of a Chinese leader trying to bring China forward. What is motivating him or her? What are their real issues? How are they going about it? Why are they doing what they're doing? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, just last night I was at a dinner with some senior Canadian officials and some senior Americans talking about this question of China. Where's it going? And how should Canada think about it? How does America think about it? Et cetera, et cetera. And I very much related to the session just previous, where to me it's completely insane that we continue, as far as I'm concerned, we continue to have what I would regard as primarily a Cold War mentality. And that's totally counterproductive in all kinds of ways, including in a world where we used to sort of divide, well, during my lifetime, there was kind of liberal democracy, market-based economies at one end of the spectrum, and authoritarian regimes and state-run economies at the other end of the spectrum. That's kind of how you saw the world. And to me, that's not terribly helpful. To me, the world today is kind of the world of order and the world of disorder. And the convergence of interests between the United States and China to me, is enormous. And to say one more point, because I think this is really central. One of the beauties of the Chinese system is, precisely because of the way it is, if they decide to do something, they will do it. So I remember when I was very involved in bringing Alan Mulally to Ford, and I remember saying to Alan early on, at Ford we have a letter sent to Henry Ford from Sun Yat-sen in 1924, essentially offering Henry Ford the Chinese market. And it wasn't answered by Henry Ford, it was answered by one of Henry Ford's staff people, which essentially said, we're not interested, okay? And so I said to Alan, Alan, then I think we had a 2.5% market share, something like that. I said, Alan, listen, you can be the biggest genius in the world. We can crawl our way from 2.5 to 3.1 to 3.7 to, we'll die and maybe we'll be at 4.3. So let's make a virtue of necessity, and let's also do the right thing. We should go right to the top of the Chinese system, and we should say to them, listen, you guys have the ability, if you choose to do it, to say, as of tomorrow, no more internal combustion engine. And we're only going to have cars that are sustainable, however we want to define them. We at Ford, we want to help you think that through and be part of that and drive that. And if we were to do that in one stroke, you'd change, to be prosaic, you'd change Ford's position in China overnight, and B, you'd change China's way of thinking about the automotive industry overnight, and by the way, you change the world, because of course now the Chinese auto market is larger than both the United States and Europe combined. And so what China now does, the whole world will have to do. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying we have to start with the premise, which I think is correct, that by and large China's leaders are no different than most other leaders, and particularly this generation of leadership. Remember, let's take Xi Jinping as an example. So Xi Jinping, here's roughly the bio. His father was vice premier of the country in 1959, and he was the youngest vice premier. And Xi Jinping in 1959 was 6 years old. So the father was vice premier, Xi Jinping is 6 years old, they're living right at the center of the whole system, everything's going great. 3 years later, 1962, Mao purges Xi Jinping's father, sent off to prison. So here's Xi Jinping at 9 years old now, out in the cold. 4 years later, Cultural Revolution, Xi Jinping sent to the countryside, age 13, basically out there until his early 20s. So essentially from age 9 to his early 20s, living with a father in prison, they're kind of banished, and/or he's living entirely on his own. And he's living entirely on his own and living that true dirt-poor existence of the Chinese rural farmer. So, and by the way, he applies during that period 15 times to join the Communist Party, and 15 times he's rejected. And then when Deng Xiaoping opens the country back up again, and the universities are opened after 10 years of a hiatus, and they have the most competitive examination in China's history, so they have 10 years of cohorts taking the exams, 2% will get in. Xi Jinping scores the highest in his county. Applies to Tsinghua University, they're terrified to admit him, so they don't admit him. Then finally, someone summons up the courage and admits him, and he goes about his way. Anyway, what I'm getting at is, so when Xi Jinping thinks about his purpose, and he thinks about trying to bring hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, this is not some conceptual idea. This was his life during the most formative period. And so I regard him as exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, well motivated, trying to do the right things for his people, as most leaders do, and not somebody sitting back trying to figure out how he's going to screw the United States. I mean, this is just not what he's doing. And that we just got to get that out of our minds. And it's I think in some ways the most appalling thing to me. I was asked to speak at a McKinsey partner, their annual conference, and it happened to be in Hong Kong, and I think it was a year ago. And I'd spoken to them 10 years earlier, and I said the same thing. I said, listen, I'm about to say something. Everybody in this room knows it's true. Everybody in this room knows it's right. I'm going to say it. It's not going to have any impact whatsoever. Every person in this room, with the exception of any Chinese who are in the room, every person in this room knows far, far, far less than he or she should about China. And you should get off your rear end and learn more, and get moving and get over there and get yourself educated. And I guarantee you, 98% of the people in the room won't do it. And that's a problem. And everyone in this room is a part of the leadership class, if you'll excuse that expression. And it's not going to change, to an earlier point, unless people get moving. And that's how it's going to change.
It's great, and I agree. Question about Barrick, then I'll take it out to the audience. You engineered a lot of change. You described it incredibly well. And it just so happened that that came about just as the gold price was falling precipitously. Does that make it easier or harder to make those changes?
Well, I think probably easier because, one of the big things in running any large organization is keeping it simple and making sure people understand context. And when the world's falling apart, you don't have to do a lot of educating about context. So it makes it easier on the one side of the coin when you have a near-death experience. On the other hand, I think that, when I first got this role, I referred to our strategy as back to the future. Because I said, listen, I'm not asking you to do something strange here. I'm asking you to be who you actually are. I'm reminding you of your own purpose and your own values. And if you don't have that purpose and you don't have those values, you're in the wrong place. And the beauty of that about that narrative was true. And most organizations and most people that go wrong, number one, they typically have their biggest problems when things are going well. Because I'm fond of saying that, all of us live on this plane of life where on one side is complacency and arrogance, and on the other side is insecurity and paranoia. And the trick is to stay up here. And for sure you're going to fall off many times. And that's why you need to have people around you who you really respect and listen to, who say, listen, you're going wrong here. Now, that's most difficult to do when things are going well. Because when things are going well, you start confusing your own inherent abilities with why good things are happening. And that's what happened to Barrick.
Great. Got a question, I think, in the back here, and then just see if anyone else has their arm up, and we'll take another one after this. Go for it.
Nina Gardner. I'm a sustainability advisor, and I teach business and human rights at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And I just want to commend you on articulating an incredible vision for a mining company, the idea of partnering with host communities. That's the first time I've heard of it. And hiring wonderful people like Jonathan Drimmer, who has been really carrying the burden of some of the tougher things out there. I have a question on the two mines that you described, and that was very poignant. Now, would you, when we have our classes, we're always discussing the whole idea of mandatory versus voluntary, and would you be an advocate of actually more regulation on mines in the U.S. or in Canada or other places when you see that there is a better way to do things?
Yeah.
And the second part of the question is, do you implement a bonus structure in the remuneration of your C-suite in terms of coming up with good ideas the way you've been describing?
Yeah, okay, so let's go in reverse order, because I should have mentioned this already. On the first point, we both do that. That is to say, we have very granular prospective goals for individuals, and we grade them at the end, and they include everything you'd expect, including generation of good ideas. We also, just this past Monday, going one step further on the whole partnership concept, this past Monday we told our people internally that we're going to give every single person at Barrick some shares in Barrick at the end of this year, which they cannot sell until they retire, because we believe so strongly that emotional and economic ownership matters to people. And we want every single individual to feel part of that. On your first question, here's the way I'd answer that question. Conceptually, where we clearly want to be is what I will call forward-leaning, intelligent set of rules. The problem is, and by the way, if I had to choose between forcing an industry to change or waiting around, I would vote in favor of forcing, because waiting is going to take too long, particularly in an industry like the one I'm describing. But to be pragmatic about it, the problem is this. Most large organizations are incapable of getting rid of things that don't make sense. And so what ends up happening is you just build and build and build and build and build, and you end up with something that is unworkable and, frankly, in many cases, just ludicrous. Some of the rules that get imposed just make no sense. So accepting the fact that the world's imperfect, if I had to go one way or the other, I'd go with rules, I mean more rules. But I'd like to think that if companies started behaving better and had better records, they get a commensurate recognition that the rule makers should be more sensible and more engaged with the people who actually know what they're doing.
You have another question out there? Yes, right over here. We'll get you a mic. This ballroom is not made for fast movement.
I'm not so loud, so I did have to wait for the mic. Hi, I'm Sarah Jacobson. I'm with UNICEF. And one question, you mentioned your partnership with Cisco, and I'm wondering if you could comment on how you've seen tech companies impact the mining industry and how you think that it might impact, and I mean in terms of raw materials as opposed to advances.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, of course, I'm painting with a very broad brush here, so let's just stipulate there are exceptions to what I'm going to say. In general, when we announced to the world that we're entering into a strategic partnership with Cisco, inside the little mining subculture, and by that I'm including companies, investors, intermediaries, banks, et cetera, inside that little world, most people said, this is much ado about nothing. Either they said, well, we already know that, we've done that, it's not going to work, some combination of debunking. To which as a narrow competitive matter is not only fine, it's good. But that shows you the mentality. So, and there are some points of light that are different than that, but they're few and far between. In fact, when I first said to John Chambers, we'd like to have a strategic relationship with you, are you open to that? He said, yeah, we'd love to do it. And in fact, it makes great sense because on the one hand, you won't be the first one trying to do this so that we've run around the track a few times. On the other hand, you're still very much at the front of the queue. Now, on the question of sort of next level down, here's another thing about at least the gold mining industry, which is not right. They spend practically zero on what I will call true R&D. So I've said, for example, to the head of our exploration, listen, if we're really going to be the leading company in our field, we should know where every ounce of gold is all over the world, number one. And then number two, we should be the leading edge of how that gets extracted. And as far as I can tell, it's a slight overstatement, but only slight. The way we extract gold today is no different than we did 100 years ago. Basically, nothing has changed. And I can't think of a single other industry where that's true. So to me, the prospects for once you're in healthy financial shape and you're economically sustainable, by definition, there should be some percentage of your revenue going into true R&D, and that R&D should be recreating how the business is actually done. And right now, that's not happening.
I've got one last question for you. You serve on a number of boards, and one question that we get quite a lot is, what is the best way for a board to think about sustainability? Is it something the whole board should take on? Is it something that, Barrick has a CSR committee, you've got an advisory board on which I'm pleased to serve. Do you have any advice for the companies out there on this?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I agree with the previous panelists who were saying the word sustainability, unfortunately, has kind of run its course. So we need a new vernacular. But to me, by definition, it's the heart of the enterprise. So the idea that you would somehow segment it makes zero sense to me, except insofar as it's a mechanism for getting the organization to kind of get with the program. It ought to be owned by the full board, for sure. I think the idea of having a separate advisory board is a good idea, because the other problem is you need to inject into the organization cutting edge ideas. And so people live their lives in a discipline or in a field are going to, by definition, know more than we're going to know. In fact, one of the most impressive things about the Chinese leadership, and we're trying to put it into Barrick, this is going to also be counterintuitive, the Chinese leadership is systematically and in a disciplined way open to ideas. In fact, their default position is there must be somebody in the world who knows about X, Y, or Z better than we do. Let's find him or her. Let's bring him or her to Beijing. Let's suck them dry of their knowledge. Then let's customize it for our circumstances, and then let's execute. The United States is absolutely the opposite. We're sort of systematically closed. So I think that, in fact, just the other day we had a discussion on this inside Barrick. People came to me with an idea, good idea. And my first question was, have we gone out and asked, whatever the number is, 5, 10, 15 people in the world who know this field best, what they think about this idea, and whether this idea we're talking about now is cutting edge, or is it kind of ho-hum? Because we're not interested in ho-hum ideas.
I love it, and we're talking about being bold, and part of being bold, in my view, and I think this is part of what you're saying, is recognize the expertise elsewhere. That helps you. You can't be bold completely all by yourself.
Correct.
Yeah. John, thank you so much. Great insights. Really appreciate it. Please join me in thanking John Thornton.